Iniciar la transmisión en vivo. Bueno, buenos días. Bienvenidos a todos. Mi nombre es Pedro Borda, ambro el nombre del CESU. Hoy voy a hacer de moderador. Quisiera hablar las primeras palabras en español para explicar que este evento se está haciendo en inglés debido a que dentro del módulo Jean Monnet los colegas europeos siempre han tenido la amabilidad de hablarnos en inglés y de hacer cursos para nosotros en inglés, a pesar de que no son sus idiomas maternos. En todo caso, me parece que es un buen ejercicio para nosotros el aprender a expresarnos en inglés y el poder disertar en inglés desde un punto de vista académico. Así que les agradezco mucho su atención y les pido, por favor, que a partir de este momento hablemos en inglés. So I'll give the welcome for everybody who's listened and all the present people. Thank you for your support and thank you for your help. I would like to introduce to Professor Ioan Jorga from Romanian University from Oradea and Professor Alejandra Ramirez from CESU, who are going to be our main guests and our introduction for today. Please, Professor Jorga, Professor Ramirez, I'll give you the floor.
Well, I'm going to start. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for accepting this invitation. I would like to say some words about what we're going to, the context in which this event was organized. First of all, it seems like 4 or 5 years ago, we assumed the challenge of trying to understand us, not watching us or seeing us, studying us from inside and from an inside perspective, but mainly to try to understand us in relationship with other countries in a global world. So this challenge was taking place, and we started to work with the Oradea University, and Professor Jorge is here. And we presented a project for the Module Jean Monnet, concours. How you say concours? I forgot all the words in English right now. So we won the project. It's a project to try to understand us in dialogue with the European community in a comparative way, but also in an interchange of experiences about the integration process they undertook and about the integration processes we are undertaking in the Latin American region. In this context, the idea was to seek for experiences and to seek for different ways of understanding the process, but also to seek for the construction of networks with other countries of the region. So this exercise of understanding us in this comparative, in this interwoven way, would let us understand the global processes that we are living as a country and as a region also. In this dialogue, there were many activities that were undertaken. First of all, we had an exchange of doctoral students and of teachers, mainly with the Romanian Oradea's University. In this interchange, in this exchange, there was Pedro Borda, who is now organizing this event, and we thank him a lot for it, that was in Romania for like 5 months, no, Pedro? And as a teacher, I went to the University of Oradea, and teachers from Oradea also came here. Right now, we are pleased to be with Professor Jorga, and that they really helped us in all the process during all the 3 years we are having the relationships with them. But this interchange and these joint activities we're having with the European universities, and especially with Oradea University, was not restricted to exchange of students. It was also it also allowed us to have some spaces to think about the issues that we were having in all the world. And this experience really started the 2020. So the pandemic was, I mean, the key issue that we had to discuss during all the time. Last year in September, we had a spring school with Oradea and with other universities of Europe and with other researchers of the Latin American region to talk about how the pandemic affected the world and how the pandemic made us more interwoven in the global process. And in this context, there was another factor that began to affect the relationships among countries, and it was the war since last year between Ukraine and Russia. Undoubtedly, that war between Ukraine and Russia affected not only Europe, but also the rest of the world and Latin America also. So since last year, we gave a lot of attention to how this conflict is impacting in all the other social issues in all the world, mainly Europe, but also in our region. Yesterday, we had a workshop with the Université of Rennes and with other researchers from Oradea and from other universities in Europe, and we just began to approach this issue of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And Pedro Borda just gave us an interesting introduction to how it affected Latin American world. And it was because yesterday we were watching the issue mainly in Europe. And now we said, well, let's see what's happening in Latin America. And this is the reason we just organized this event to try to think us as a Latin American region, to try to think Latin American region within the conflict of Ukraine and Russia. And so I really want to thank especially Pedro Borda for all his moving to organize this event. And as always, thank you, Professor Jorga, for accompanying today with your presentation and to help us in all these activities we undertook since 2020. So I think with that, I'm going to close, and just one more thing. I would like to thank you, Sergio, Yvonne, Daniel, Oscar, for being here and to exchange with us their perspective about this issue. So go ahead, Pedro. I give you the word.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to please make a really short introduction, a kind of briefing about what I said yesterday. So then I will give the floor to Professor Jorga to please give him some perspective from Europe. So in first place, when we talk about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, we have to talk about what is the immediate meaning for international relations. And yesterday I was saying that it has a lot of implications, mainly for international law. Ukrainian conflict meant the failure of the Minsk agreements and the failure of the international law and its mechanisms as the way to prevent international conflicts. Not only that, it also showed that even between blocs, there is some kind of dispute of struggle for soft power. In Latin American perspective, and with this I will give you the floor to Professor Jorga, it also showed that Latin America has not unity as a region. It showed that we are very dependent of ideological blocs. And there is a lack of leadership. The main potencies in Latin American world hasn't took a defined position about the world. They always play with the devil and with God, and in some kind of way to say it. So without no further introduction, I give you the floor to Professor Jan Jorga. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I'm very happy to share with your colleagues, your friends from Bolivia, special, because I know that you are Bolivian citizen, but some of you live in Europe. And I'm happy to share some consideration concerning the global implication of the war in Ukraine. But I come from Romania. I come from one city that Romania is west of Romania, near the border with Hungary. But also the border with Ukraine, it's at 150 kilometers far from us, but is part of Ukraine that it is silence. But if we regard, for example, the maps of Romania, Romania is too close to the major activity of the war. Crimea, it's in a right line at 350 kilometers far from Bucharest. That we are in the proximity, very strong proximity of the war. We live the war from outside, but we live this tragedy. And from this reason, maybe sometimes in my presentation you will feel a little bit some subjective dimension. But to be more objective in the presentation, I decided to show you the last issues of a journal, Europe Asia Studies, that is publishing by the Center for the Russian Eastern European Studies from University of Glasgow, a journal that is has a very long history from 1949. Why decided to take in my consideration this content of the journal? Because the last issues of these journals from November 2020 has the topic Russian role in the post-Soviet Eurasia. That is a result of one project that cover different specialists in the problems of the Russian, special Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union. By this author, I quote just two, Elias Goetz from Institute of Strategic Studies from Copenhagen, from Royal Institute in Defense from Copenhagen, and Professor Andrei Tsigankov is a Russian specialist, but he lives now in the United States. He's professor in the United States. And what, from this perspective, from the perspective of this, the specialists from this journal, what's happened now in Ukraine? It's the results of not only 30-year revolution of Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union, but also the former Soviet countries, but also is the results of history of evolution of Russia in part of Soviet Union, like Tsarist Empire, and so on and so on. And from this reason, the specialists they participated in this project. They said to explain what's happened now in the war, Russian-Ukrainian war, we must take in consideration three three dimensions. One is impact of the domestic drivers on the Russian roles in the post-Soviet Eurasia. Because these specialists said that Russia, after the collapse of Soviet Union, after the disappear the Soviet Union, the society is divided like in every country. We have the liberal, we have the centrist, we have the nationalists, and so on. But all these drivers expect that Russia don't lose the status role, the major driver in the post-Sovietic area, but from all perspectives, with different tools. Second dimension is the role of civilizationist drivers in the role of the Russia in the post-Soviet Eurasia. What means when the communist ideology was put out, but this ideology was replaced by another ideology. That this ideology existed every time, only in Soviet time existed. The ideology of Eurasia, role of the Russia in this area that is a bridge between Europe and East of Asia. Here we have like tools. We have the pan-orthodoxia tool. We have the how I say that the complexity of the policy from a Middle Age between the Mongol Empire and the Russian state, and so on and so on. And they are all integrating this civilizationist driver. But the last, but not least, dimension is the geopolitical drivers that have the role for the Russia in post-Soviet Soviet Eurasia. Here we talked about the Turkey, for example, that Turkey after 19 tried to take back the influence in the Central Asia, but also in the South Caucasian Asia. We talked here about the European Union with his policy to neighborhood policy. They come on the border of the former Soviet Union. And we talked here about the NATO, the United States. We talk here about the China, like the driver, that geopolitical driver they became here, that determinate a little bit this evolution of Russia to assume this role, I say the hegemon in the former Soviet, in the post-Soviet Eurasia. What means Eurasia? Eurasia means for the specialist, like concept, all the former Soviet countries minus the Baltic state. Okay, that is a perspective that was offered by the colleagues from they contributed to these journals. concerning my perspective, the perspective that I present has a special, how I say it, a spatial dimension. But I push my consideration, short consideration, on the timing or evolution of role of Russia in this in the Eurasia region. I come back to December 91. In December 91, the three countries that was the founder of the Soviet Union, Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus, on signed in near Minsk the agreement to dissolution of the Soviet Union. Recognize each country recognize the frontier of the Soviet countries. Russia recognized the frontier of the Ukraine, including Crimea, of the Belarus, and so on. That represent technically the collapse of Soviet Union, the finish of history of Soviet Union. And after this moment, we observe in the former Soviet area two evolutions. One evolution is this that I mentioned before. Russia tried to assume more and more a role to be the driver in the post-Soviet area. Another side, we have the movement of autonomous of the all former Soviet countries. First of all, get out from the Soviet space, Baltic state. But other countries like Moldova, like Ukraine, like Georgia show some autonomous attitude, but also some Central Asian countries. And in 1994, was signed in Budapest in December the memorandum when the signature was Russia, Ukraine, UK, and United States. And it's very important this moment because after this memorandum, once again, Russia recognized the frontier of the Ukraine. But the frontier of Ukraine was guaranteed in Budapest by the three big countries, by the three nuclear countries, Russia, US, and UK. Ukraine, which was in this moment the third nuclear countries, had a very big heritage of Soviet nuclear weapons, decided to give to the Russia all these nuclear weapons, 1,900 weapons, and Ukraine decided to be a country without any nuclear army. And Russia received 1/3 of his actual potential nuclear power. And second aspect was the question of the maritime power of Russia, because was in Crimea the center of this army, and they signed it by this agreement for 49 years. Ukraine accept that the harbor from Sevastopol is the host for the Russian maritime army. And of course, Crimea was part of Ukraine. Russia paid for this host. Also, Russia paid for the service offered by the Ukrainians to the army. But we saw that beginning of last decenny of 20th century, Russia was part of legal world, recognized by the legal documents the existence of Ukraine, the border of former Soviet Ukraine. And from this moment, we have until 2008, we have what the Russian specialists in international relations, we have the use of soft instrument of the Russian power in the Eurasia, like the energetic tools, like the instrument banks, investments in former Soviet countries, and so on and so on. But with the war in Georgia in 2008, Russia start to use also the hard tools to be accepted like the hegemon in the Eurasia by the former Soviet countries, Russia used the Russian minorities from the former Soviet countries, also the tool of invasion of the military tools. With the annexation of the Crimea, with the crisis from Donbass, Russia showed that for his intention to be like the leader in the region of Eurasia, Russia could dispose of the tools that Russia annexed Crimea, that Russia don't respect international law. Russia push the minority from Donbass to develop a separatist movement, and so on and so on. But the specialists and also the liberal specialists from Russia, but also Western specialists in international relations, consider that the moment 2014, the moment when the Russia balance from soft power tools useful in Eurasia region to the hard tools. But the war in Ukraine is, how I said, the biggest moment that showed that Russia would like to use all tools to achieve his imperialist intention. But I hope by these two perspectives, one spatial and my presentation like in diachrony, I give you some consideration come from somebody who live in the proximity of this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. So, without further time, I'd like to ask to Dr. Daniela Gramont to take the floor, please. Daniel. Daniel, estimado amigo. Oh, well, maybe giving Daniel a couple of minutes to reconnect.
Hello. Yeah, hello.
Please, Daniel, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm having some troubles. One moment. Okay, can you see me now? Maybe if I close the other. Yeah, can you see me now?
Yes, Professor, we can see you now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So I have prepared a presentation, and I'm going to share my screen for that. Just one moment. Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm going to set my clock for 20 minutes, right?
A little bit more. There is no problem. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Pedro, for the kind invitation. Thank you to the authorities of the university. And, well, this is a really important topic to discuss. Sadly, in Bolivia, there's a small notion about the world, low interest about what's going on. And maybe what people have received the most are the voting of within the United Nations or some videos about the war. But it's really important to discuss about the impact in Latin America, was the title of this seminar, and this is what I prepared. And my presentation is going to deepen this topic, decoupling and the technological war and the great power competition between China and the US. Because this is the context in which this attack is going on, and this is how the impacts are going to be felt in the region. So the first part is going to deepen this concept that we call now the technological war, the great power competition between China and the US, and then I'm going to deepen Russia, okay? So first of all, this attack happens at a particular moment in the international system. The crisis of the liberal world order was already deepening. Since the beginning of the 2000s, this rules-based order that was useful for more than 5 decades was proven limited. And then this COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these tendencies. So this specific moment, which we call the tech war here, is the specific geopolitical moment we're living from a Cold War, which lasted until the early 90s, Then this unipolar moment, which proved really short, brief, like 12, 15 years, in which the US was the only reigning hegemon, to a period which we call the Tech War. So to understand this particular moment in which the invasion occurs, we refer to this period as the decline of the West and the rise of the rest. It's a rare moment in international relations, as some authors acknowledge, in which all mainstream theories accept that the hegemony of the liberal world order is over. The hegemony of the Western powers, who designed and also implemented and enforced this order, this hegemony is over. Due to several factors, but we can summarize them in two main pillars. First of all, the decline of the West, which means the decline of economic power of US and Europe, which also implied the loss of their political power in the world, but also because of a break within the alliance. Not only their power decreased, but also this alliance that designed this order since the end of World War II, and then after 1999 became a global order, was in question. I can recall this picture of Donald Trump in 2019 in Europe, in the reunion with European leaders, screaming at them at the NATO reunion that they should pay for their defense, that they rely on the US, and that the US is tired of defending them. And then also it's a crisis of these liberal values within the West, capitalism and democracy. So these internal struggles were impacting external policies, and their power was in question. And this happens at the same time as this other pillar, the rise of the rest, means a growth of these other actors. Their power began to grow, not only non-state actors following me and how they acquired more power than even some states, but also what Western academia calls illiberal powers. These emerging economies who acquired so much economic power that placed them in the international scenario, and obviously they wanted to have a voice, not only to have economic power, but to have a voice in world affairs. We can talk about the BRICS, but we can also talk about other powers, just as Iran, with Russia and China, and this is one topic we're going to address later. So in this decline of the West and rise of the rest, there is one clear tendency that is emerging more with more power than the others, and it is hegemonic competition. This great power competition, hegemonic competition, as you would like to call it, which is the struggle between China and the US. Far from those times in which the US cataloged China as a great partner, and they were mostly interested in inserting China into the capitalist global economy, in 2017, Donald Trump approves this new strategy in the US, labeling China as a strategic competition. All relations with China are a matter of national security. It's not only to talk about business or economy, as his administration said. This was a huge mistake by the US. And the first response of China is to call for calm down to all the other world leaders in the Davos Forum. This famous speech: if the US don't want to support liberal globalization anymore, okay, here China is willing to do that and take this role. But given the policies applied by the US, this Cold War of our times began to hit a little bit, not in terms of mean that globalization is over. It doesn't mean that we are now entering a phase just like we had in the interwar period. No, but some clear tendencies can be seen according to the Peterson Institute, as you can see here. In 2008, because of the crisis, the financial crisis of the US, already began this period called globalization, which means that there is a retreat in several economic flows. And this means that this period of almost 5 decades of growth of trade and finance was slowing down. Of course, this happens at the same time of this crisis of the liberal hegemony, and this liberal, neoliberal globalization is in question. Not only from the South. If you can recall from the South, already in the 70s, we had some complaints. We had the G77, UNCTAD, and we managed to have some changes. But now this question to the liberal globalizations come from Western powers themselves, the ones who created this. We can recall also Donald Trump's policies saying that globalization has really harmed the US, free trade agreements. This only made that all factories moved to Asia. So Europe lost production, the US lost production, and Asia is the new factory of the world. Of course, this happened because of this graph. If you follow me here in the upper left graph, nominal GDP in US dollars, we see that from the late 90s, China's growth began to accelerate. And then these 2-digit growth rates made it that China became a serious competitor for the US. Of course, companies were earning a lot of money. Western companies investing in China, moving their production there to produce for selling to the West, selling to the world, but then also selling in the Chinese market. But this obviously made that China became a huge power. So if you are a leader from the US, you can clearly see that there's a problem. They are going to overcome us. Are we going to let this happen? Just like the UK peacefully let this hegemonic transition happen with the rise of the US? And well, even with Obama, it appeared that this was the case. The US was going to let China become the next world power because they were earning a lot of money. This change of government, Donald Trump, he said, no, we are going to take measures to prevent this. And it's interesting that with the Biden administration, nothing changed about the China policy. China is currently the world's largest manufacturing superpower, with 28% of global production in 2019. Then the US with 16%, Japan with 7%, Germany 5%. So it was pretty obvious that China was not the producer of low-tech goods, trying to follow what US companies were saying. So in this case, what some call Donald Trump's paranoia was justified. The US was facing an hegemonic competition. This is the tariffs. We don't have time to deepen this. So let me check. Yeah. So these were the tariffs applied by the US, the response by China. Manufacture, yes, of course, they both compete in this. And this trade war evolved into what we have now, which is the tech war. This term, technological war, as Stu Magnusson describes, will someday be referred to the Cold War of our times. This is what the world is living. A Cold War between two great powers, which previously to the Russian attack, there was a consensus that said, even if we don't envision a military attack, this Cold War will be growing in intensity in economic flows. Well, now with the Russian attack and this risk of nuclear extension rising, this is not so true. But what is true is that this economic competition is growing in intensity. So it's important to analyze who is really China and the impact it has on the US. And according to several authors, this is the single most important challenge that the US has. In the case of Japan, it resulted pretty easy for the US to annihilate any option of Japan to becoming the next world power. You can recall at the end of the 70s, US negotiating with Japan. If you don't limit your production, we're going to have problems. So Japan voluntarily decided to slow down. In this case, with China, it was not possible. So still, despite their growing protectionist policies, the main concern is that they will not be able to slow down China, just like with Japan or Germany. And this technological competition is, in fact, a competition for future hegemony. We're not talking about factories anymore. Who has more factories, who can produce the better televisions or even cars or even airplanes, okay? China has already entered this realm. No, we're talking about high-tech goods and the digital economy. These will define future hegemony. Some data I have to show about this competition, and then we can understand what's the role of Latin America in the middle of this and how China is impacting this. So talking about high-tech goods and the digital economy and technological supremacy, there are only two competitors. We have to be clear with this. Russia is not a competitor, and the European Union is not a competitor. It's between US and China. For example, the technological firms, which also produce big data, which also have the ability to improve artificial intelligence, and these are under the umbrella of two states, China and the US. So we have Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, then some Chinese companies, but falling short in this category, the US regarding companies that sell the digital goods to the economy, the US is the winner. We have also to acknowledge that Chinese copycats are doing a great job. So we have Amazon, then Alibaba, Facebook, Tencent, Alphabet, Baidu, Apple, Xiaomi, Twitter, Weibo. And we're talking about the global economy. It's not only two countries, but that these two countries have the whole global market. Maybe the European Union will keep on increasing digital rights, okay, and protection of data, but still they will have at the end of the day to deal with these companies. Chip production, which is a huge topic for the geopolitical struggle in the world. In this, the US is also the most advantaged one, but has to work with these partners. It's not only chips produced in the US, but also its partners. So in this case, the US has an advantage, but has to keep on good relations, okay, with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Europe, again, falling short. Then we have 5G, another huge example. And in this one, China is leading the race. China with Huawei and ZTE. No wonder why the US attacked directly these two companies. And so this gives me the hint to talk now about Russia and Latin America, because this great power competition between China and the US has to impact all the other nations. It's not about only producing the better technology. It's not about only selling to others, but China and the US need partners, the majority of partners, for the implementation of this technology. Okay, so now, let me check my, okay, yeah, a few minutes. Implications for Latin America. Okay, now we can talk about what's the role of Russia in this great power competition so we can understand a bit Latin America's voting at the United Nations, or embassies supporting one country or the other. Okay, first of all, to the right, in this graph to the right, you see that obviously there are two great powers competing, the US and China. The US with 22 trillion, the GDP, and China with 16. Russia, you will find Russia here, small nation, 1.6, just like Spain, lower than Italy. There are two great powers, yes. Maybe if we take the European Union altogether, yes. But we can find some regions in the world, and well, it depends if one or the other can consider them partners. At least South Korea or even India was considered a partner of the West, and after Russia's attack to Ukraine, this has proved wrong. Talking about population, yes, there we find the huge power of Asia, and this is one of the biggest flaws in the West. The global population middle is located in Asia. This is only following tendencies with Angus Madison data, so we can see China and India, this red and orange, they are following. They are trying to recover what they had in the past. Here is what the Chinese call the humiliation century, in which the UK and then other European powers managed to open Chinese economy, and they were reduced to a small nation, according to GDP. The growth of the US, okay, but now we're witnessing the return of the drug and this rise of other powers. In this economy, in this global economy, who is Russia? With this data from the Atlas of Economic Complexity from the MIT, we can better understand who Russia is. Okay, Russia is not a large manufacturer. Russia doesn't have the technology needed to produce the high-tech goods now. Russia is mostly an exporter of raw materials, what we call in Latin America extractivism. Well, Russia is the king of extractivism, with one difference. Luckily, they have the resources and the infrastructure to keep on selling. Not like Latin America, for example. If you see oil production in Venezuela fell every year for the past 10 years, gas production in Bolivia, or mining in several countries. In the case of Russia, they are extractivists, but they know how to do it. So they are one of the world's largest oil producers, gas exporters. And then we find copper, aluminum, gold, platinum. Also, this yellow category, let's not forget about that. Russia is one of the world's leading wheat producers, just like Ukraine. Some industrial production, but mostly low tech. In this case, gas turbines, for example. When the Nord Stream 1 had a problem, Russia had to import this turbine from Canada. You know, they didn't have the technology to repair it.
Please, Professor, what's your time?
Excuse me?
Please, Professor, what's your time?
Watch Mike. Yeah, 4 more minutes. It's okay?
Yes, please, Professor.
Okay. And obviously, Russia's trading partners are not located in Latin America. The main in both imports and exports is China, then Europe and Asia. In turn, for Latin America, okay, let's compare this. What the French minister said: we're going to wage a total economic and financial war on Russia. We're going to cause the collapse of the Russian economy. But if we take a look at this, just one moment, this NATO United, there was also a response. So what are Latin America's interests in this? We can see the voting. Okay, at the beginning, some voting appeared to be in favor of Ukraine, in favor of stopping this attack. But also, this map is interesting, talking about collapsing the Russian economy. These are the countries who effectively impose sanctions to Russia. And obviously, the natural gas located here, who was sold to Europe and now is zero, cannot be sold to these others so easily. But other products can be. And even the import goods that that Russia needs, that they don't sell anymore, they're buying it through other countries. So Latin America, if you see it here in sanctions, it's a clear map to say, okay, maybe we have voted condemning this attack, but business are business, and we don't follow the West in this. So what would be the interest for this? Russia, for the import and export of goods for international trade, is not a major partner. We don't have interest with Russia. Take a look at this as Latin America, the first import partner, USA, then China, Brazil, Canada, Japan, etc. And number 32, Russia. Then for imports, USA, China, Brazil, Germany, blah, 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 and then number 18, Russia. Really small share of international trade. Let's talk about investment. In the period 2015-2019, okay, it's an average, then 22, 2021. Most investment flows come from the US, then the European Union, Canada, Japan. And where is Russia in this? Where can we locate it? No, there are no Russian firms investing. In this case, mergers and acquisition in the upper graph. In this other case, FDI in the lower graph. Okay, we see US, China, Singapore, Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, Brazil, Netherlands, Canada, Israel. In FDI, USA, Spain, Germany, Italy, France, China, and so on and so on. So to talk about interests, in this case, Russia has one huge advantage in the region, which is the anti-imperialist trauma, because economic partner, Russia doesn't represent anything. What we sell, what we buy, and the investments we expect are mostly from Western powers. From these ones who applied the sanctions, yes, and we don't want to follow their lead, and we have an autonomous voice now, not like in the 80s, but I hope it was clear that economic ties we don't have with Russia. So in this hegemonic struggle between China and the US, our biggest decision, our biggest challenge is to follow the US or to follow China. Nowadays, China and Russia are having a united voice, okay? So maybe it's easier to have this decision, China and Russia. We don't know how much it is going to last. And let me give you just some examples, like 5G. Several nations were trying to decide which 5G. So if they decided for the Chinese 5G, next day, a visit from the US ambassador complaining, or if they decided for the US, next day, Chinese ambassador complaining. So we are caught in the middle of this tech war. And Russia, the way it arrives to the region is through the partnership with China, because they have one united bloc nowadays, but this is political. And economical, we don't have any huge interest with Russia. Yeah, okay, I don't have more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really amazing, your presentation. You always amaze me with your quality. By the way, in a way to apologize with Professor Agramont, he has an economics degree in the Catholic Bolivian University. He has a master's degree in international relationships, and actually he's doing his PhD degree in the Frankfurt University, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, thanks.
He's, for me, is one of the best professors we have in Bolivia. Thank you very much for your support, Professor. So now let me please introduce to Oscar Esteban Gracia. He has a PhD degree in political philology, if I'm not mistaken too. He's actually Nowadays, he's a professor in the Bolivian private university. So please, I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. It's political philosophy, my PhD. I would like to start by thanking the CESU for the invitation and for the possibility of this space of dialogue. And I would also like to thank both Dr. Jorge and Professor Agramont for the very interesting talks that have preceded mine. I'm going to be focusing my talk on an element that I believe is decisive for the configuration of contemporary international society. I'm talking about the mass media as configurators and reproducers of international phenomena, and the way in which these media are experienced throughout the globe. This is key, for example, when it comes to understanding both the Latin American perception of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the way in which this perception intersects with the current political structures and conflicts in the region. In this sense, the following talk, I gotta say, summarizes some of the theoretical assumptions and central hypotheses of an ongoing investigation that I and a group of students of both the International Relations and the Communication undergraduate programs at Universidad Privada Boliviana are developing. This research tries to reveal the way in which political polarization in Bolivia affects the perception of war events in the Ukraine region. In that sense, I would apologize for the provisional nature and hypothetical character of some of the following ideas, and I hope you understand the pressing conditions in which such a fast-paced global present puts the efforts of academic understanding. In 1941, George Schwarzenberger wrote about the phenomena that can be considered international, that I quote, "We have to ask ourselves whether and to what degree these questions are relevant from the point of view of the international society considered as a whole. International affairs are relations between groups and individuals, and between individuals, which essentially affect international society as such. In this sense, the degree of essential affectation that a social phenomenon has on international society would constitute the fundamental criterion of its internationality." Of course, when Schwarzenberger expressed this idea, one already had some direct experience of the way in which the mass media can define the morphology of the international arena. Printing and telegraphy, for example, had a major effect on the global configuration of experience in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. However, during the second half of the 20th century, and much more so in the first decades of the 21st century, the dizzying growth of the complexity and influence of mass media has no historical comparison. We live today in what appropriately John B. Thompson has called mediatic worldliness, a space in which everything concrete and objective is traversed by representations and schemes derived from the communication matrix of the mass media. In this sense, it is worth asking, how is the potential internationality of a social event reconfigured through the new conditions of formation and media reproduction of the world experience? It is not the case that even the most localized social events generate through their media coverage an essential effect on the attention and action of international society and its different organizations. And to what extent is our social experience at the international level inevitably affected by certain possibilities and tendencies of the media, such as the framing of events or the profound decontextualization of them? These are questions that undoubtedly should be understood based on specific investigations that analyze the phenomena of international reality in their factual deployment, and in this case, in their specific resonance in the Latin America environment. And there is no better opportunity, I think, for this than the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, an event that has certainly captured world attention in the last year. Of course, it is difficult to draw definitive or even firm conclusions about an event that is still in progress. Fortunately, we have a significant number of reflections that previously have referred not only to the role that the communication technologies have been acquiring in the formation of reality and the perception of war in general, but also to the historical deployment of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as of 2014. The writer and analyst Peter Susiu, for example, has called the Russia-Ukrainian war the first, I quote, full-blown social media war, while Conger and Satariano see it as, I quote again, the first full-blown cyber war and the first hacker war featuring both state and non-state actors attacking the information infrastructures of the combatants. According to Kuryak, this episode would constitute the most recent step in a set of historical developments that have been transforming the mass media into essential protagonists of the war. This deployment would have as its most important milestones the Vietnam War as the first television war, and the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 as the first internet war, in which, for example, war blogs played an important role. In the case of the influence of the media in the constitution of international reality, it is important to consider the concept of framing, which has been gaining notable importance in the social sciences and humanities in recent decades. According to Entman, I quote, framing is a process of selecting some aspects of perceived reality and making them more salient to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation. Robert Svet points out that framing plays a decisive role in the social and individual interpretation of events, and Irving Goffman already understood it as, I quote, blueprints of interpretation which enable individuals to locate, notice, identify, and give meaning to events taking place in their personal lives as well as the world around them. Thanks to frames, some coincidental loose elements or events construct a coherent whole, answering the question, what is going on here? Okay, so in this sense, it is perceptible that in a world essentially traversed by the media, the process of selecting the phenomena, the perspectives, the lights and shadows through which the mass media frame international events constitutes a fundamental point of reference for social interpretation of daily reality throughout the world. Such framing, of course, does not necessarily stem from perverse intentions or even deliberate narrative building exercises. Not necessarily. Olive Boyd Barrett has pointed out that, I quote, all human communications, in order to have communicative agency, must select, focus, and highlight certain potentials for meaning at the expense of others. This is an inescapable feature of the nature of human sense-making, one that is ingrained in human biology, the author says. In this sense, the same author will note that intentions are not always readily accessible to the consciousness of those who own them, but may be the result of unreflective habit or presumption. Also adding that successful persuasion may often entail forms of communication that begin intentionally and purposefully, but that are later adopted by others whose level of reflexive awareness, if any, is lower. This last point, I think, is decisive since it speaks of different possible levels of intentionality that in general refer to different structures of interpretation in the communicational field. Schuffel has pointed to the importance of differentiating between two types of frames in this framing condition: media or news frames and individual frames. Media frames could be defined as central ideas or storylines that provide meaning to certain sequences of events, while individual frames may be considered clusters of ideas that guide processing of information on the individual level. in the media and global reality of the present world, it is clear that we have a permanent interaction between these two levels, although in a different dimension. On the one hand, we have the persistence of certain hegemonic narratives that condition the framing of different media, acquiring a global character. This is the case, for example, of the horizon of understanding that defines the story of the main traditional media in the West, although, of course, there is a counter-narrative that responds to the interest and purposes of the Russian vision. In this way, we have media framings that, as more or less coherent structures, are deployed with the pretension of covering the global scope. On the other hand, we have the individual framings, which, because they now refer to culturally plural and highly diverse set of receivers, are always contextualized in different horizons of social understanding. Thus, the perspective with which each individual relates to information coming from the mass media is, in turn, mediated by the set of social and historical circumstances that characterize his present reality at the time of interpretation. How, in this sense, can it be thought that this set of conditions, previously exposed, define the mode of Latin American reception of the events of the war between Russia and Ukraine? In the first instance, we have to think that, as Boyd Barrett has shown in detail in his study of the media coverage of the post-Euromaidan revolution Ukrainian crisis, two narratives are heralded that have a global reach and are disseminated through what could be called the Western mainstream media, an alternative, and the alternative, this is pro-Russian almost, media. It is clear that this division responds to the world division that is established, at least in some sense, between two hegemonic projects that express the US, this is the US project in conjunction with its NATO allies, and the Russian project. This disjunction of perspectives in the formation and reproduction of information on the events of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine would cover, according to Boyd Barrett, such elementary points as the cause of the 2014 Euromaidan revolution crisis, the nature of the new regime in Kiev, the representation of the Euromaidan movement, the role of Russia and European Union in the conflict, and the nature of the protests and the measures taken by the population of eastern Ukraine. It is clear in any case that, at least at a hypothetical level, there are no reasons to think that this polarization in the interpretations has been structurally transformed in the case of the current war between Russia and Ukraine, especially with the greater contemporary role of social media. In the case of the war in Donbass, for example, Makartik and Sidorova have managed to conclude that, in general terms, the use of social media for visual framing of the war in Donbass facilitated construction of different and often mutually exclusive views on the conflict in eastern Ukraine among pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian internet users. This suggests that polarization is a progressive constant, at least in recent years, with the growing media coverage of the war. One has, then, that at the level of the framing of the global media, the war has been constructed and reproduced discursively from two different currents of interpretation, each of which is aligned with the general perspective about the developing facts sustained on the one hand by the Western Bloc, and on the other by the Russian government. Now, we could ask ourselves, what is the circumstance of framing at the individual level? In the first place, when we are speaking about the individual plane of interpretation, we have to locate ourselves more concretely, in this case, in the Latin American context. This context, as Goldstein, Svampa, and Lalander have proven, for different cases, has been characterized in the last decade by significant social and political polarization. Figures like Chavez, Maduro, and Evo Morales, and more recently Bolsonaro or Boric, in Chile have brought to the fore a dichotomy between left and right, a very complex dichotomy between left and right that has its different dimensions in every particular country. In this sense, the different text from, for example, which Alex Ojeda has analyzed the role of social media in the context of social and political polarization typical of the 2019 crisis in Bolivia, are illustrative. In such works, it is noted that despite not being the only actors, the most recent mass media have an important potential to radicalize the circumstances of division and antagonism within societies such as the Bolivian one. There is no reason to think that this situation would be different in other countries of the region in a greater or minor scale. Thus, the individual framing of each receiver of information in Bolivia is demarcated by the context of conflict and ideological division that defines its own local scenario. 3 research questions, this is of the ongoing research we're trying to conduct in this moment. 3 questions seem especially relevant and would guide the investigation, obviously. To what extent, the first one, to what extent does individual affinity with the left or the right at the local level replicate in a greater affinity with the Western or Russian narrative of the war between Russia and Ukraine? Second, to what extent does the narrative that is preferred about the said war reinforces or modifies the conditions with which the dichotomy between left and right is thought and lived at the local level? And 3, to what extent can the aggravation or attenuation of political polarization at the local level lead to a transformation in the interpretation of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And just to finish my presentation, the 3 hypotheses from which our research has started and which are still under, verification today are the following. First, there is an important correlation between political affinity with the left or the right at the local level and the adoption of one of the narratives, Western or Russian, offered by the international media. Affiliation with the left implies a greater approach to the pro-Russian narrative, while affiliation with the right implies a greater affinity with the Western narrative. Second, the way in which the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is interpreted tends to reinforce the positions that one occupies in the local political and ideological spectrum. This, I would think, is the more complicated hypothesis. And 3, the aggravation or attenuation of political polarization has little effect on interpretations or perspectives regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine that have been constructed prior to such attenuation or aggravations. We hope to conclude with the proposed research by the middle of this year, and in this way better understand the interactions that through the media plane exist between different actors and levels that constitute the international plane. And that would be the end of my presentation. I thank you kindly for your invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very well-argued presentation, and I have a few questions at the end. Thank you very much again. So I would like to ask Professor Yvonne van de Mien. She is a sociologist from Europe, and she has a master's degree in Latin American and Caribbean studies, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you very much. You have the floor, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Daniel and Oscar, for your wonderful presentations. Thank you for the invitation of being here. I think it's fantastic to have heard the economic point of view and the political philosophy perspective on this topic, because I think we are really feeling different parts of analysis, and this makes it just a wonderful gathering, I think. My presentation is really about asking questions mostly. I find that, well, first of all, I want to say sorry for not having a PowerPoint presentation. I have had electricity issues. I live in a very small town and electricity was gone, so I could not prepare my PowerPoint presentation. I usually have one to accompany me on my dissertation, but in this case, it will just be speech. I want to start by saying Latin America is not really relevant for the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Relatively, yeah? Because of course there are different ways in which it can indirectly have an influence or a certain amount of impact. But as Daniel has thoroughly showed us, the direct influence is really minimal, in the sense that, I mean, the position of a Latin American country or of the region itself will not determine what Putin will do or what Ukraine will do, or how the EU will take decisions in this whole conflict. We have seen in the last year that the way in which Latin America has been involved in this conflict has been mostly projecting itself as a supporter or a counter-actor of the invasion of Ukraine. And in this sense, I think this is more interesting for what it says about Latin American international politics than about the conflict or the international geopolitical spectrum itself. So I think it says more about how Latin America is deciding to project itself, and then taking Oscar's ideas into account of how the media and how social media has so much influence in how, well, in the reality that everyone is going to live in the future. Every day is shaped by how things are framed in the media. No, so I really liked that idea, Oscar, because I think everything we say about this conflict is within these margins. So that's really important to take into account. So how has Latin America decided to project itself in the media? Well, I think it's really interesting as to how the countries have reacted initially. I mean, on day one of the invasion, or well, day 2 and 3, the reactions were clear and very loud, you could say, in the sense that Maduro, of course, expressed their support for Ukraine, Venezuela's support for Ukraine. However, other countries have maintained themselves more neutral, you could say. And I think what has been happening in the last months is that Latin America has kind of decided to not make so much noise about the conflict. Firstly, because whatever they say, whatever a Latin American country decides to say about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it says something about their relationship to US or China. So I think politicians, diplomats have been very careful in the words they choose to give an opinion about the conflict. And this is interesting because it makes us wonder how much is determined, or how dependent are Latin American countries still on US, for example, or how important is this political projection, international projection, for the relations between Latin American countries and China. No? Are Latin American countries willing to protect their relationships with China and US more than giving their honest opinion about the conflict? Or what are the priorities? I mean, I don't think there are answers to these questions, because we will never know the deep truth of what presidents or administrations, Latin American administrations, are really thinking. What we know is mostly what they project in the international media again. But there are a few interesting examples that are worth mentioning. I think Lula, for example, I find it particularly interesting that Lula has won an election in Brazil after the Ukraine conflict, and this really makes it an interesting fact, no? That Brazilians are not, well, what I think is that Brazilians are not really worried about the position of a president in the Ukraine Russia conflict, it's really a very distant thing. And Lula, for example, has said that Zelensky is as responsible as Putin for the conflict. This is quite well, you could say quite a determined opinion, saying that, well, not giving full support to one or the other side, but saying that Ukraine is also responsible for what has happened is quite a strong saying. But then on the other hand, Lula has recently met with Biden and has proposed forming some kind of alliance or group to promote peace in Ukraine. No? So then again, you really don't know how to read the side of Lula, but I don't think that's his intention either. I think what Lula is trying to show is neutrality and promotion of peace. I think that's the face that he wants to show. AMLO, for example, in Mexico, another important, very important country in Latin America, has again and again shown and insisted on neutrality regarding the conflict of Ukraine and Russia. And again, Mexico is so close to so close to the U.S. and so far away from God. That's the country that has this complex, very historic and complex and delicate relationship with the USA. So whatever Mexico says about this conflict, I think has the most impact of any country in Latin America, and it insists on neutrality. Petro from Colombia also pledges no involvement in the conflict, and also is not actively promoting peace, but at least discursively is promoting peace in the conflict. Fernandez from Argentina, he has met with Putin in person, I think at the beginning of the conflict. And again, this was news at the moment. Oh, he's meeting with Putin. What does that say about Argentina's position? Of course, he's the leftist. He's part of the semi-communist countries of Latin America, and that's why he's meeting with Putin. But he has recently also rejected any kind of support or military support in the conflict, and he has actually made a reclaim to Putin, saying that this conflict should end. And it's funny how this happened. Actually, well, what the media says is that Putin called Fernandez to congratulate him for winning the World Cup, and Fernandez used this opportunity to question him about the conflict in the Ukraine. So it's not that he actively planned to make a meeting with Putin to say something about the conflict. It's just he used the moment in a very coincidental manner to give a slight opinion about the conflict. So we have mixed signs from Latin American leaders. We have a lot of neutrality, and what I think we can say more or less in a general way is that Latin America is projecting itself as the good, humanitarian, peace-promoting region, neutral region in this whole conflict. But why is this important? Actually, I mean, the economic impact will not be significant. I think, again, Daniel has showed us how distant we are in economic relations with Russia as a region. And I mean, anything that happens in this political spectrum, I really don't think it will have any kind of impact. So why is it important for Latin America to project itself as a neutral, peace-promoting region? Well, I think this is a more interesting question. I think Latin America is perhaps using the opportunity of giving an opinion about the conflict to project its perhaps new type of international politics, of relating with the world and other countries on an international platform. I think it's quite sane, or at least it's not provoking for Latin America to give sides or to project a partnership with either Russia or Ukraine. I think it really maintains Latin America on the margin of the whole conflict. Whether that's good or bad, well, I don't know. Maybe there are certain countries that should take a position because maybe that would help to solve the conflict at least a little bit. But countries in Latin America choose not to do so, and I think this is a very conscious choice. And I don't know if I agree with this because I am now I want to present to you my first argument. I'm not fully certain of this, but it is more a question that I'm throwing out there for all of us to maybe reflect on. Are we looking at a Latin American, perhaps a way or type of doing international politics that has shifted from being ideologically motivated, looking a few years back when this conflict was not underway? Well, it was either projecting yourself as the leftist leader who is allied, well, more open to China and more friendly relations with Russia, and more or less friendly relations with the USA, which that is for already many decades has been the Latin American way of doing international politics. And has this ideologically motivated way of doing international politics shifted to a more business is business type of rhetoric? This is my question, and why am I saying this? I think Latin America now is taking care more of its business. I think China has already, much before the conflict, China has already brought to Latin America this idea as having to choose of doing business with China or not, of making these economic alliances with China or not. Whether a country did it or not said much about its political color. So Latin America has been dealing with China already for many years. And in Bolivia, I mean, talking about China is a big theme in any kind of social reunion. It's either you support that the government has been letting China do so much in Bolivia and giving China so many projects, infrastructural projects, for example. Is it a good or bad thing for the country? And this is a typical political discussion in Bolivian everyday life. So I think choosing this color already has its practice in countries in Latin America. And I think what Latin America has decided to say is, well, it's really convenient to work with China because it's much cheaper. And yes, they will have a negative impact in this or this sense. We'll talk to environmentalists, for example. Well, China is much less careful, they would say, well, many would say, or at least it is some type of argument, that perhaps China has a much greater negative environmental impact than any other country would when doing business in Latin America. So yeah, there are these different sides, and I think Latin American countries have decided to just call it business is business. You know, it's cheap, it's what we need, and this is what we're going to do. And I'm not only talking about Bolivia. This is happening in many countries. Again, China is a really important economic actor. Daniel has showed us very clearly. So yeah, I think I really think that this type of relating with China has invaded the spectrum of international politics in Latin America. And this is why I pose this question. Perhaps now Latin America is realizing that it's more convenient to act in a way of business is business, and I will say what is convenient in terms of business, and less, perhaps less dependent on ideological color, motivated reasons, rhetorics. So yeah, I hope I got my message through with that question. I have one more question. I'm completely lost with the time, so I'm sorry. I don't think I'm in the 20 minutes yet, but I was wondering, I thought it was difficult to talk about anything else for this particular occasion, but I was wondering, how would the Ukraine-Russia conflict be a reference for Latin America for future geopolitics, because that's what this event is about, but also for internal politics, for national politics. How can we think that this conflict can teach us something as Latin American countries? And well, this is again just a question that I posed out there. I haven't deepened in this particular analysis, but I do find this a very interesting question. In a world that is so interconnected, where technology is a factor, and we are dealing with each other, whether it's for business or political closeness, I do think it is important to take into account that such a devastating conflict as it is the one in Ukraine and Russia, it has to have an impact on all of us, on the whole world. I mean, the internet is on our hands perhaps more than 8 hours a day, and we are seeing all these things happen, and it has to have an influence on us. Oscar also explained, I mean, we are our reality is coming to us through media. So this conflict certainly has an influence on our society on a social, political, economic level, but I think it is too soon to talk about these consequences still for our countries. I would like to end my presentation there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. You were very bright as usual. So at the end of the presentations, we have one more. We are going to have a little space for another questions and some little debate. I have to preserve myself in the role of chairman, so I cannot cheat and expose what I think. So now I want to give the floor to our friend Sergio Arispe. He is a lawyer and diplomat from Bolivia. He currently is teaching geopolitics in the Academia Boliviana Diplomática, si no me equivoco, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a good friend, and it's a pleasure to give him the floor. Thank you very much. Your floor, Sergio.
Pleasure, Pedro. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it and you can hear me. All right, perfect. I think first of all, I need to kind of state very briefly what I thought about your presentations, which were all truly important and I think very synergetic with what I'm going to say. I want to state clearly that I think, like it has been stated here before, that we are facing an inter-imperial confrontation. And when we face these types of matters, I think we must try, at least in these spaces, to not make these look as black and white matters. I believe that what Pedro said in the initial round of context of this conversation is true. I think one of the main reasons why initiatives such as UNASUR and ALBA have not been successful when compared to ASEAN, the Association of Southeastern Nations, is that we've become entrenched in ideological blocks. Furthermore, Professor Orga talks about civilizational drivers. I must talk about the Euro-Asian vision and what little I've read from Russian authors. Perhaps one that sticks to mind is Alexander Dugin, and how he starts to interpret that there's a greater tendency for Russia now to look towards Asia and not towards Europe, which is, of course, a byproduct of what we're seeing happen today. This diplomatic distrust that I believe will be entrenched more in Russia will ultimately lead towards a scenario of geographical non-rationality. Why? Because geographically speaking, the majority of the population in Russia is European, and Europe still constitutes a geographical continuity up until the Ural Mountains, which today is being bypassed by entrenched positions that will not lead towards consensus. Agramont talks about the critical information that has to do with the information vis-a-vis between Latin America and Russia. But at the same time, we're seeing that this position that is being overwhelmingly told to the public in Russia is avoiding what is ultimately historically necessary to understand. Russia and German economic ties prior to both wars and up until probably a couple of months ago were probably the strongest amongst European countries, a factor we cannot just put to the side. And Gracia Landaeta talks about this conflict as a social media conflict. What little I've read about this, but something that left behind a lasting effect, is a book by Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and how, in her words, perhaps there's already a clear winner on who gets to influence electoral processes and other social processes through media outlets. And I think that's important to state. And I think Van Diemen at the same time puts on board what a bit of reality of what the context is of Latin America and how we can truly influence what occurs in what otherwise is inter-imperial interests that go way beyond the political realm of influence of Latin America. I'll continue to my presentation and move forward from there. As yesterday, for those that were with me yesterday, I think that I still need to repeat some of this because it's important to state time and time again. We live in a time of geopolitical confrontation. To greater military conflict and all the hampering diplomatic solutions. I think this essentially has to do with the geographical encroachment of non-Western global powers onto what's understood as the areas of strategic influence of the US. And obviously the control and grasp of strategic resources like rare earths, lithium, etc. All of these are the enablers of the future green economy. And to have this occur here obviously leads to global and regional tensions. I think we're not giving enough emphasis on what diplomatic meetings mean and how they should be prioritized or facilitated. This will lead to diplomatic isolationism and entrenched positions, so much so that an incident like the balloon incident that recently occurred in the US has led Anthony Blinken to postpone his visit to Beijing, an obvious no-no in diplomatic relationships. And again, new economic players are emerging, which are reconfiguring the world. And this obviously has to do with what I'm showing you here on the screen. There are global superpowers in a now more multipolar situation, which have obvious areas and regions of influence, which we might not like, but are real. And where these overlap one to another, this will obviously lead towards increased tensions. Unfortunately, we live in an area which is being disputed. More so, I think when we talk about macroeconomic forecasts, we have to be more aware, especially here in Latin America, that our future economic partners no longer just lay in Europe or in the US. But I think our Eurocentric educational methodologies and just reality limits our possibility of understanding that the world is much more than just Europe and the US. And this is obvious in just the level of representation or embassies that Bolivia has in the world. We do not have enough presence in Southeast Asia or in Africa. And to tell you the truth, there are not many diplomats that even would ponder going there because it's such an obscure idea to them. And it's such an obscure region where most people, when we're talking about society reflecting itself in the political realm, can probably not name 10 cities in Africa or in Southeast Asia, in areas where, unfortunately or unfortunately, the world will now evolve onto. This is a graph that states the importance of the GDP per region up until 2050. Here we see that, of course, Asia Pacific will be more and more of importance in the world as we see it. Again, will this lead to a new type of diplomacy? I think not. I think multilateralism is way behind where it should be. There is no true need to change what is obviously a post-World War II scenario. I mean, if in reality, can you say that India is of a lesser importance than England? But who's in the Security Council? Who's a permanent member of the Security Council? India is the fifth economy of the world. Indonesia will probably be up there in the coming years. Where are they? Where's Brazil? So multilateralism needs to change for this to improve, for us to truly move forward towards a true multilateral solution. Global decisions at present do not reflect multilateralism. That is a fact, like it or not. We lack a renewed arms control treaty. We do not have weapons deployment moratoriums. These must be given high priority if we're not to jump into a nuclear war. And if you're talking about what is the so-called international rule of law, there is an obvious double standard here. Why? Because commitments by the West are not taken forward. To put an example, Paris Accord Agreement, $100 billion from developed countries onto developing nation countries, never attained. Just to put an example, Germany placed $100 billion just in military rearmament for next year. There is a destruction of strategic European energetic infrastructure. There is a lack of international investigation by this. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh just wrote a piece on that. Ultimately, at least this should lead to an international investigation. Human rights abuses are on both sides of the geopolitical spectrum. We do not live in a world that's made by Disney, where they're the bad guys and the good guys. There is a seizure of private funds, which goes against international law. We're not talking about just funds that belong to a state, but the privates. You might not like them, but they are private funds, and it goes against the international frameworks. There is recognition of illegitimate rulers. Just look at the Guaido incident. Where is he? Who is he now? There is a weaponization of the SWIFT mechanism. I mean, there are so many other possibilities of looking at this double standard, which is delegitimizing the world rule of law. Why was there NATO in the first place? In the first place, NATO was brought as a means of regional defense against what was a possible Soviet Union attack on Europe. Okay, but since the fall of the Soviet Union, there is still a constant expansion of NATO. In 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were 17 countries. Today, there's 29 countries in NATO. Russian presidents have always stated this will lead to a new division in Europe. It's one of the fundamental causes, I think, of this conflict in the first place. An ex-Secretary of State, James Baker, indicated before that NATO would not move an inch to the east of its current position. This is hearsay, nothing ever respected. But ultimately, is Russia what the Soviet Union once was? Because we have to understand this to see if this is a true adversary for the West in Europe. Just compare the GDPs of the realities. In 1989, the Soviet Union was the second GDP with 2.7 trillion compared to the 5.2 trillion by the US, which was number one. Yes, it was an economic adversary. Now compare this to 2022. US has close to 21 trillion for GDP and Russia 1.48. Russia is not the hegemon that it once was or when the Soviet Union was. And thus, I don't believe it would willingly go to war against the European bloc, but yet it has its areas of influence and its buffer zones, which must be respected, we like it or not. Only in recent months has Russia been able to transform itself gradually to a war economy, a war industry which is probably responding to a situation of a post-special military operation, unfortunately. Russia is not the big red wolf that once scared the democracies of the West. We obviously have to understand there are geopolitical strategies that have to be beared in mind for the Russian political elite. For this, we have to understand that there is, for example, the heartland theory, which was a theory coined by a British geographer, Mackinder. But from this geographical theory, there are conditions or geopolitical actions which are being set into play that are creating the conditions, or they want to create the conditions of the balkanization of this territory, or this disintegration of Russia, and all the problems that that would lead to if you would really analyze the effects of this. A military superpower with nuclear warheads divided into many countries. Why? It's simple. This area has vast potentials of natural resources, growing Asian demand right beside it, and this could support the growing need of Asia. This is what they ultimately need to enforce and control. Is it true that the US was involved in the Euromaidan? Of course. If not, just look at this, who this lady is, Victoria Nuland, currently serving as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. This person in 2013 was the Deputy Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. This person was actively participating in demonstrations that were staged in Kiev when they overthrew Yanukovych. It doesn't become more clear this. And this is what diplomats from the region state time and time again, probably not publicly, but we cannot be taken for fools in this aspect. Again, modern Russia is a construct based on hydrocarbon and mineral wealth. This is what are the foundations of its economy. Do you think, honestly, that this country would attack its own infrastructure? An infrastructure that secures what, for example, one of its key companies does, provide the equivalent of 40% of this continent's needs. Oil and gas production account for 40% of Russia's fiscal budget. Really? They would do this? So it's quite surprising that an event as important as this is silenced both in the EU and in particular in Germany, when 3 out of the 4 gas lines were destroyed. I think it needs to be attended through an international investigation quickly. The guy that's stating this is not a nobody. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, Seymour Hersh. He's one of the main persons that talked about the realities of human rights abuse in Abu Ghraib. We're not talking about someone that is a pro-left or pro or against the Western world type of journalist. Now, how do I see this affecting the Latin American region? I think it's a grim scenario for Latin America. Why so? Because there's enormous Chinese economic links in our region. And because of this, I think this will lead to a greater number of activities contrary to our sovereign interests, particularly now that there's a confrontation, an open confrontation between the West and what could possibly be the BRICS Plus. If you talk about how important the PRC's military power is starting to be, there are military expertise in America stating that it is no longer feasible or possible for the US to have a military confrontation in Southeast Asia with China. They are not a mere military force. They are now a global force. And I think ultimately what we need to be worried about, and I think that lack representative area of influence, which the PRC will contest with the US, much like the US contests Taiwan in China's area of influence. And why? And where are they going to focus on? There is a continuous onslaught of US diplomacy trying to dismantle the digital architectures that China has placed in Latin America, spatial domain, ports, airports, and other strategic infrastructure that is already being consolidated in Latin America and the Caribbean because of these other countries placing interests in Latin America. We never should deny that the Monroe Doctrine is still very active and present in political decision makers in the US. Another thing that shows a bit of diplomatic loss of force here in Latin America is that this PRC diplomacy of flipping the recognition of Taiwan is still and will be continue to be a prioritized agenda for Chinese diplomacy. And in Latin America, as of late, there are less and less countries recognizing and are now recognizing Beijing. This is not a minor thing. Some candidates that look to be some of the countries that will also look to flip the other way are Honduras. Xiomara Castro has stated her intention to recognize the PRC. Paraguay, if Abdo fails to win, this will probably lead to a change of diplomatic relations. In Haiti, recent polls state that Haitians want to recognize the PRC as a means of furthering economic ties. Currently, 8 of the 14 states that continue to recognize Taiwan in Latin America are here. So it's still something that kind of shows the increased and systematic weight of China in its diplomatic outreach here in Latin America. When you talk about Chinese infrastructure, it's not a small thing. I mean, you only have to bear in mind, for example, what Shanghai is. Shanghai is Costco Shipping Ports, one of the biggest hegemons of Chinese business, is creating one of the biggest ports, if I'm not mistaken, the largest port in South America, which is being built 80 kilometers north of Lima in an area called Chancay. This is going to be a multi-purpose port terminal, and it's a milestone. And this will probably be one of the preferred points of departure of raw materials that will leave from Peru abundance of many mineral resources towards China. I mean, this is a matter that obviously I believe is one of the main reasons why we see what's happening in Peru. I'll get into that a bit later. And if you talk about critical infrastructure and what this might represent onto defense interests in the U.S., there's a recent study by the U.S. Strategic Studies Institute that states that it's very worrisome that China can collect digital information through the phones that they provide, which the brands that we all know here in Latin America, Huawei, ZTE, Xiaomi, Oppo, all the critical infrastructure in telecommunications, which are done by Huawei, by ZTE, and some of the satellites that are already being put together and being launched jointly with Brazil, 5 with Brazil, 3 with Venezuela, 1 with Bolivia, a deep space radar in Neuquén, Argentina, satellite data sharing agreements with Peru. I mean, these are not minor infrastructure that, for example, can be overlooked. And I think ultimately, like I said before, this is not, they're the good guys, they're the bad guys. I think both have interest looking to nudge what could become bothersome to them in their areas of influence. Another thing is that the BRICS Plus bloc, I think little by little will be more and more important. You can see that Saudi Arabia is starting to already sign major hydrocarbon deals with China, with Qatar, and, for example, recent statements by Algeria, Argentina, Turkey, Egypt, Indonesia to join BRICS is not, I think, a very well-received information by the Western Bloc. Recent statement by Sergei Lavrov and Qin Gang, which is the new Chinese counterpart for Lavrov, has stated that there's going to be a merger between the BRI and the European Eurasian Economic Union. This means that the biggest trade development in the 21st century, which is China's new Silk Road, will be more complex and continues to expand. And ultimately, with the EU weakened by Washington's, intrusion into Europe and how this might lead toward a deindustrialization in Germany, which is also being brought onto the table with Macron and Scholz telling the US, why are you giving them subsidies for the companies that are in the European Union to leave and go towards your country? I mean, there's all types of really obscure matters there. I think this was also stated by one of the colleagues. I have it here. I mean, China is not just a copycat anymore. If you talk about some of the published studies, particularly in engineering, you see that if you put onto the table a comparison between 2010 and 2020, China is now leading the way when it comes to published papers. And right now, and this is 2020, perhaps it's even better now, China was having at least 23% of all published scientific papers that have to do with engineering. I mean, this is not a lesser amount. I mean, I think their ears are starting to stand up. And ultimately, I think Latin America will become a possible battlefield. I think recent declaration from General Laura Richardson, which is the general in charge of Southcom, and the importance of natural resources here in Latin America being very important to U.S. hegemonic space is still important. I think declarations such as this one from Peruvian parliamentary, which states that they would try to occupy Bolivia and grab hold of the natural resources here, might be taken a bit as a joke by some people, but you can see that those types of formulations or conversations are starting to take place. So you have to acknowledge that sustained pro-American political structures are of great importance in this political confrontation. Peru's current situation, I think, is of the utmost importance and needs to be followed. Peru at present is in the midst of a power confrontation that doesn't only confront local interests, historic interests, but also has to do with how the world will be defined. Bolivia recently stating that it has agreed an association with CATL and other important companies from China is not something I think that will be well received in this matter. And as a conclusion, I think that it should scare us. I believe the U.S. is still willing to provide support to local armed forces. We see that they're still supporting Dina Boluarte's government. I think this still has the objective of ensuring natural resource access and dominance. I think what happened in Brasilia is also a matter of importance because it must not underestimate that it's a reflection of the growing discontent of the political right with electoral processes. And I think this has a synergy we must not look away from. And I think ultimately Latin America must be vigilant that there's not a geopolitical division of the world between China and the US, much like what the West did with the Soviet Union after the Second World War. This is a picture of a piece of paper that Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin shared, delimiting the areas of influence of the Soviet and capitalist bloc. Like I said, we're not talking about the good guys or the bad guys, but we're talking about interests that could profoundly destabilize our region. And this is something to be worrisome about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very, very, very good presentation. So in order to begin the round of questions, I would like to remind the two questions that our friend Yvonne has shared with us about the framing, if I'm not mistaken, and the second about, I'm sorry, Yvonne, can you please remind us?
Yes, of course. The first question was, are we witnessing a shift of Latin American international politics from ideologically motivated style of doing international politics and relations to a business is business type of doing international politics and relations? That is question number one. And the other question is, well, what will the impact of the conflict be in Latin America? No, again, I think really it is too soon to say, but of course, I would love to hear the opinion of everyone here. What can we learn from the conflict, and how will it influence our Latin American society?
Thank you very much, Yvonne. So, to begin the debate and opening the questions, I would like to answer the few things I have read about this to Yvonne. There is an immediate impact of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, mainly in the commodities market. So it says that for those countries that produce oil and gas, it has been an opportunity, and especially with Venezuela, because Venezuela wasn't taking any real profits with their alliance with Russia, and other than the military equipment. So this crisis made that the United States approach to Venezuela not with the intention more than an economic level, that we need to some support to rely the pressure from the Russian sanctions that meant for the gas market. So, giving food to this debate, I would like to ask for another participant comments, especially with the role of China. And this is my question: how do we see the role of China, and how do we read the narrative that they build when they talk about international relations based in five principles, which in summary we can say that speak about the respect and the mutual benefit. So how do you understand that? And please, I give you the floor. Please, Sergio.
I think there's been a huge loss of respect between these two hegemons. I think Pelosi's visit of Taiwan sets the course to a cat and mouse agenda. I think, like I stated in my prior intervention, I think what the U.S. will ultimately achieve in Taiwan, China will try to achieve here in Latin America. Will try to entrench itself, try to bother, to obstruct, and to provoke the other hegemon, which believes that this area of influence is of importance to them. I believe that China has the economic portfolio and outreach to indeed bother the U.S. in Latin America. But all these games, which ultimately that's what they are, in the inter-imperial conflict, who pays for it? And I think Latin America could be otherwise destabilized and put under the knife. And that's the issue that I think we must not digress from. I think that we must not move away from regional compromise, but it's very hard if we make these regional blocks something ideologically based, because both the left and the right will not be stable, politically speaking, here in Latin America. We've seen how close the electoral race was in Brazil, in Colombia. This just pretty much tells you that there is not sufficient information to say that there will be continuity. And if you idealize regional blocks, it'll be the end of it. That'll be it. Thank you.
So, continuing with the debate, I would like to ask our colleague Gracia about the framing process in Latin America. When we talk about the diplomatic posture that Latin America has thought about the Ukrainian and Russian conflict, we can see that there is this splitting between the speech and how do we say things and how do we do things, and the framing process does not is something that is very related with, as my point of view, with the instrumental reason of the states, Latin American states. And then you can see that, for example, when you read what happened with Bolsonaro and the conflict, Bolsonaro says that he didn't want any problem with Russia, and he went to Russia because Brazil needs a lot of agriculture commodities related with that. So my question is, how do you understand this this correlation between the speech and the operation of the Latin American states and the framing process of the speeches and narratives that are present in the media?
Yes, thank you for that question, Pedro. Well, my analysis is basically focusing on the non-state public opinion level. So I would have to say that there is a lot of conditions and of different conditions that are joined in the framing of an event as such as the war between Ukraine and Russia. A lot of them are social, political conditions locally established. But I would say that the way in which, in that public opinion, that social public opinion, the position of a government, such as Bolivian government, the Luis Arce Catacora government, is in relation to that event, the Ukrainian-Russian war, is already framed by a previous conception of the let's say essence of the government itself, right? So I do believe that the framing, the social framing of the public opinion, it's both mediating the popular opinion on the related to the war as itself and to the position of the president of the state in relation to that war. Yes. I don't know if I answer your question or if I actually get it right.
Well, thank you, Oscar. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Alejandra and Professor Ivan. Maybe they have some questions or some comments.
First of all, was very impressive for me this debate because I learned so much from the presentation of all colleagues. It's interesting to see which type of the challenge are for Latin America from this ping pong that is another side of the world. And I remember here the one article of John Scheimer from November in International Studies. This topic was presented a little bit by Daniele. The article is about the new World War, Cold War, U.S.-China rivalry. And in this article, Mersheimer said it's compulsory for United States that Russia will be not basculate in the camp of China. That is was in November 2021. Just 3 months before the war. And I'm in contact with Professor Mersheimer, and in April, I write him, please give me some approach of you about the new situation. And Professor Mersheimer said, but he published after this approach in Foreign Affairs, and he said the game is loose. Because by starting the war in Ukraine, the divided of a possible alliance between Russia and the Western bloc is definitely close. And come now to presentation of Sergio. I appreciate very much this perspective because Sergio China, but we saw that just the declaration from 4 February 2022 from Beijing between Putin and Xi Jinping is the start of the new challenge, the new relation between Russia and China. But if we study the evolution of the competition inside of Eurasia, we observe that we have a competition between economic community union of Eurasia, that is the leader, the Russia, and the great program of Xi Jinping launched in 2013, One Belt, One Road, and after the conclusion of Russian colleague that I have in contact before the war, because now it's very difficult to have the contact. And they said that Russia accept to accommodate his regional position in Eurasia with the interests of China. That Sergio show very well this perspective. But we have a game very interesting, but also very dangerous, not only for our region, but also for your region.
Thank you very much, Professor. Maybe Professor Alejandra would like to add something to the comments?
Not really. I would like to. I mean, it's time to finish because we've been. Oh, maybe Yvonne wants to say something
Yvonne,
before closing the event.
Sorry, it was right before you said we have to finish that I raised my hand. No, I just wanted to emphasize that, of course, the topic of this particular event was the geopolitical impact of the conflict of Ukraine in Latin America. But I think there is perhaps something more important and coming about in what is happening in Ukraine, and that is on a level of national identity and social consequences that are taking place in a country like Ukraine under the circumstances that it is in, that I think we need to be very alert of, especially in a country like Bolivia. We are all Bolivian here, so we can understand what has happened in our country since 2019 and the polarized country we are in, and the impact of what a conflict like that does to identity. When a person is on the tip of the gun, having to choose in terms of what their identity is, am I a Russian or a Ukrainian? And this is something that we Bolivians need to take a close look at, because I think in the future this can serve as very useful analysis for the social impact that we are living in our own country.
Thank you, Yvonne, and I'm sorry if I forgot to give you more floor. Thank you, everybody, and I really appreciate your participation. You have a great level, and you showed a great ethics and professionality. Thank you, Professor Jorge. Thank you, Professor Alejandra. And so I will close this webinar. Goodbye and have a good day.